Hey everybody, welcome to the video. It's Saturday, April 17th, and we're breaking down both slates that we have over on DraftKings today. We have a nice early slate starting at 2:10 p.m. Eastern that has 6 games, then a 5-game main slate tonight starting at 7:05 p.m. Eastern. So what I did for the most part, instead of making 2 separate videos, just kind of mix and match the players together in one video, and I'll try to mention if they're in the early slate or the late slate, and we'll just go from there. But it should be pretty easy to understand. And if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like, hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel, and hit that notification bell as well so you don't miss out whenever I post new videos. And if you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that if you want access into my entire data sheet, which has all the numbers you'd want every single day for MLB, and I do cover other sports as well, including NASCAR, NBA, NFL when that time comes, and other things like that. You can join the Discord community as well. And like I mentioned, I got an optimizer, ownership projections, rankings, and all that fun stuff. So if you are interested, link is down below for that if you want to join the community. And if you want to follow me over on social media, Pennell16 on Twitter and CPen16 over on IG. But I think that's it for the shameless plug. So without further ado, let's dive into today's video. As per usual, we will start with the pitchers and move on to the bats. And the pitching overall in these slates, it's okay. The problem is the really good pitchers are kind of in bad matchups. Like we got Clayton Kershaw, who's a top-level pitcher. He's facing the Padres, and they crush left-handed pitching. Then we have Yu Darvish going up against the Dodgers. He's a great pitcher, but the Dodgers, pretty much the best team in baseball hitting right-handed pitchers. Now, the one positive for Yu Darvish here is that Cody Bellinger will still be out of the lineup, so it definitely softens the blow a little bit, but this is still an amazing lineup. You got Corey Seager, Mookie Betts, Justin Turner, and the list goes on. It's a very good lineup, so it's still going to be hard for him to navigate through this, but I still think the talent of Yu Darvish can at least nullify the pretty good lineup that the Dodgers do have, and they only have a 3.87 implied team total here, so it's not like Vegas thinks he's gonna get rocked here. He's probably gonna give up a run or two, but I still think that can come with close to like 6 to 10 strikeouts, somewhere in that range today. He's a slight underdog here, but Clayton Kershaw's on the mound, so a lot of strike to him in Vegas, which I totally get. But a 7.5K prop over in Vegas, and the strikeouts should be there for Yu Darvish. And only $9,400. I do think we're getting a nice price tag on him. Last year, he's one of the best pitchers in baseball at 2.82 xFIP, a strikeout rate above 30%. Didn't really walk too many guys, gave up no power whatsoever, only 0.59 home runs per 9 innings. Now again, I hate this matchup versus the Dodgers. If you want to look at their overall splits last season, 2 right-handed pitching, they had a 20% K rate, 9% walk rate, 240 ISO, 260 batting average, 355 WOBA, and a 126 WRC+. I'd have to check that off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure those are the best numbers in baseball. But with no Cody Bellinger, it just softens it a little bit. Still an amazing lineup overall, so it's not like I'm scoffing at it and think that Yu Darvish is just going to mow these guys down. He might have some trouble here and there in a few innings, but overall at $9,400, I do think he is a fine option. If he wasn't facing the Dodgers, we're probably talking that he's above $10,000, so I think we're getting a nice depressed price tag, and I think it's fair given the matchup. Then over on the early slate, we have Sonny Gray, $9,300, making his season debut at home in Great American Small Park, and Sonny Gray is a very good pitcher. He has not pitched yet this year, but the news is that he's not expected to have a pitch count, so we should be good for around 90 to 100 pitches here. It's still his first start, so maybe they kind of push that back a little bit into the upper 70s, low 80s. I'm hoping not, because he's a little pricey here at $9,300, but he's definitely the best pitching option on the early slate, in my opinion. Only a 3.76 implied team total against him. Now, this is a hitter-friendly park. They don't call it Great American Small Park for no reason, and we saw the Reds' offense go absolutely ballistic last night. I think they scored, like 10 runs? They had a field goal and a touchdown. I mean, they went off versus the Indians, and I'm an Indians fan, so that was definitely a tough game to watch for me. And the Reds' offense has been pretty good so far this year, so I do think they could pick up a win for Sonny Gray to get that 4-point bonus over on DraftKings, but he's a slight favorite here. 6.5K prop over in Vegas, and his numbers were pretty good last year. Had a similar strikeout rate to Yu Darvish last season. xFIP wasn't too far off as well. Now, I did walk a lot more guys, about even more, so double the walk rate of Yu Darvish last season, but he didn't give up much power whatsoever, low home run per 9 innings, which is good because he's in a hitter-friendly park that does give up quite a bit of home runs, so he can keep the ball on the ground, has a high ground ball rate, only a 23% fly ball rate, good ratios, doesn't allow a lot of hard contact, so I'm liking Sonny Gray here quite a bit, and this Indians lineup is not very good. Yes, there's a couple good hitters. Jose Ramirez, he's an elite level hitter, obviously the best hitter in that lineup, and then Eddie Rosario's fine, batting cleanup, but outside of those guys, well, maybe Framber Reyes is another threat as well, but outside of those three, I should say, it's just a really bad lineup. Cesar Hernandez, he's not very good. I mean, he's okay, but he's still not that great, and it's not someone I would fear. And you got the guys at the bottom of the order are absolutely horrible. Some very easy outs there and some easy strikeouts. So I think Sonny Gray is definitely the best pitcher to use on the early slate, not factoring the price tag or anything. I do realize it's a bit of a steep price tag for Sonny Gray, but I still think he's fine relative to the other options that we have on that slate. It's a pretty good matchup as well. Then back to the late slate, we have Zach Greinke, $8,700. If you do not want to play Yu Darvish in that tough matchup versus the Dodgers, I get it because that's scary. I don't typically like to use any pitcher whatsoever versus the Dodgers. It's just we don't have that many great options at pitcher on today's slate. But Zach Greinke's in a good spot versus the Seattle Mariners, who do strike out quite a bit versus both righties and lefties. They don't possess a ton of power as well. The only problem with Zach Greinke is it just doesn't make sense how he's still good. Like, I know last start he kind of got beat up versus the Tigers. I want to say at -5 points in that game over on DraftKings, but he's still able to navigate his way through lineups, even though he does not have like any velocity on his pitches anymore. Like, he just keeps getting away with it. Pitches the contact. He still had a 25% K rate last year. I'm just not sure how he does it. He's a very crafty pitcher. Doesn't really walk guys whatsoever. Only a 3% walk rate last season with a 25% K rate. I'm just not sure how he keeps getting through lineups, but this is a good spot here versus Seattle. Now, they do have a team total close to 4 here, but he is a slight favorite, 5.5 K prop over in Vegas. I mean, I think he's a fine option. Still a 3.51 xFIP last season. The last start was definitely concerning versus the Tigers, although they were on a bit of a hot streak there. But the Seattle Mariners lineup versus righties last season, it wasn't very good. They had a 24% K rate, close to double-digit walk rate, which I don't love, but Zach Greinke's not a guy that's going to walk a lot of guys. 146 ISO, 241 batting average, 310 WOBA, and 99 WRC+. So I think Zach Greinke is fine if you just don't want to play Yu Darvish or Clayton Kershaw in those tough matchups versus San Diego and LA. Those are obviously the two best pitchers on the slate. Problem is the matchups are very tough and they can certainly get into some trouble. So if you're looking for a softball matchup here, Zach Greinke is your guy, but I just don't think he offers the same kind of upside guys like Clayton Kershaw or Yu Darvish offer. It's just more of a comfort play facing Seattle. But they got a couple guys in the lineup that could give him some trouble. But overall, I think Zach Greinke should have a relatively boring game. But maybe that's what you're looking for instead of an exciting game from like a Yu Darvish or Clayton Kershaw. And then dropping down to the SP2s on these slates, we have Trevor Cahill at $6,900. He's an SP2 option on the late slate, and he looks like the only SP2 option that offers you even just a little bit of upside because he does have a decent K rate. Now, he's a completely wild pitcher, so you have to be very, very careful with Trevor Cahill here. He's not the kind of guy you want to go all in because he can either go complete busto or he can have a really strong game. We've had 2 starts from this season. His first start was versus the Cincinnati Reds. He had -2 points, but then his next start was versus the San Diego Padres. Pretty tough matchup, you would think. He had 22.3 points in that game and had 8 strikeouts. And he does have a good K rate. It's just he walks a lot of guys and he'll give up plenty of power as well. Last season, it was only a 25-inning sample size, but a 3.2 ERA with a 4.48 xFIP, so got a little bit lucky there. A really nice 29% K rate, but a 13% walk rate. Last season overall just didn't give up much power, but in seasons past, he's been a guy that will give up plenty of power to both lefties and righties. Looking specifically at lefties last year, 14-inning sample size, but it had a 3.4 xFIP, 26% K rate, didn't give up much power whatsoever. So the numbers last season weren't too bad. He did have a 32% K rate to righties. So there's some strikeout upside here versus Milwaukee, and Milwaukee's a team that will strike out quite a bit versus right-handed pitching. So I do think there's just a little bit of upside here for Trevor Cahill. He's got a 4.27 implied team total against him. Slight underdog here, only a 4.5 K prop over in Vegas, but this is mainly just a price play and looking for a little bit of strikeout upside because the other SP2s on this slate are looking pretty rough. Like, we got Brett Anderson. I know it's a good matchup versus Pittsburgh, but he just does not strike anybody out. Dane Dunning is a somewhat interesting option versus Baltimore, but I do find it a little bit hard to trust them, although he has been okay so far to start the season. But the Baltimore Orioles, I know people like to pick on them, but they don't have that bad of a team. DJ Stewart's not bad. Cedric Mullins isn't bad. Anthony Santander, he's not too bad. Trey Mancini's pretty good. I actually kind of like their lineup a little bit, and I actually think they're a decent sneaky stack today. Their implied team total, I think, sitting at around 4, so I don't think a lot of people are going to be too excited about them, but the Rangers pitching staff and their bullpen's not very good, so I'm not really sure I want to go with Dunning today. Then you got Jose Quintana versus the Minnesota Twins, Chris Flexen versus Houston. I realize they're missing a decent amount of their good players, but still, I'm not really wanting to play Chris Flexen. Then Dean Kramer versus the Rangers. I actually think the Rangers are one of the best stacks in the late slate, so I'm not really sure where else we're going to go at SP2. Now, you don't have to play a cheap SP2. You could easily play Darvish and Greinke together. I'm just saying if you want to go super cheap on that slate and try to get like a 7K to 6K pitcher, Trevor Cahill is the only one that looks somewhat viable. But you could easily play Yu Darvish and Zach Greinke. You don't have to play these super cheap pitchers on this slate. Then dropping down to an SP2 option on the early slate, we have Huascar Ynoa here at $6,800 and a pretty good matchup versus Chicago Cubs. I know people don't typically think of the Cubs as a good matchup. But so far this year, they have been really struggling versus right-handed pitching so far. I've been using righties quite a few times versus them, and it has worked out, I feel like, almost every single time. So I could definitely get behind some Manoah here. Now, I'm not really sure how deep he's going to go into the game. He only has 3 starts so far this year. Well, I guess I should say 2 starts. The first time, he only went 1 inning through 14 pitches, so not really going to count that. But his second start, only threw 68 pitches. Then in the last start, he went 82 pitches. So if we can keep ramping that up, that's a nice trend in the right direction. But like I said, I like this matchup here versus the Cubs. They've really struggled versus righties so far this year. They have an implied team total below 4. He's a slight favorite, 5.5K prop over in Vegas. Also looks like the wind is going to be blowing in a bit in Wrigley Field, which is a boost to pitching. So that's another positive here for Oscar Noah. But looking at his numbers last year, it's kind of weird that he had that 10 strikeout game. It might be more so due to the fact that he was facing the Marlins, and we've seen the Marlins really struggle versus righties so far this year, so you have to factor that in a little bit as well. Because looking at his numbers last year, he had a 5.39 xFIP, 17% K rate, double-digit walk rate, and some pretty overall bad numbers, allowed close to a 40% hard contact rate. The one positive thing for him was that he did have a 55% ground ball rate, so I like keeping the ball on the ground, and plus, with the wind blowing, that's going to be a boost for him as well. So if he can build upon that last start he had, I don't think he's going to have 10 strikeouts again. But even if he just gets like a handful of strikeouts, like say he meets expectations in Vegas, gets around 5 to 6 strikeouts, only gives up a couple runs at $6,800, if he could be in line for the win at the end of the day, that's really not that bad of a time at $6,800. So I don't think he's a bad option down low. If you don't like Noah, there's a couple decent options, maybe a Cole Irvin versus Detroit, although I know I did have him on the spreadsheet. I took him off because I'm not super confident in it. I didn't really want to kind of put him on as a play up here, but I do think he is somewhat viable versus Detroit. Nick Pavetta versus the White Sox. I kind of like stacking against Pavetta, but when you play Pavetta, he's the kind of guy where you can play him, but you better make a hedge stack against him as well, because he could easily blow up. He's got strikeout upside, but he can walk a lot of guys. You have a lot of power as well. So if he's on his game, your stack will be dead, your hedge stack. But if he's off his game and he has some decent ownership, your White Sox stack, it could absolutely blow up as well. Then if you want to go a little bit lower, we have Casey Mize at $6,700. I prefer righties versus Oakland because they have a pretty right-handed heavy lineup, so I think he might be okay. He had a really good start last time out versus the Houston Astros, and I feel like this is a somewhat better matchup here, although I do think the Oakland Athletics are a decent stack tonight, so I'm not super confident in Casey Mize. I'd rather stack against him than use him, but he's just another option down low because there's just not that many great SP2s in this slate, and Sonny Gray is really the only pitcher that I have somewhat any confidence in whatsoever. But with that being said, I think we can move on to the bats at this point. And as per usual, we'll start with the catcher position, move around the diamond, and hit the outfield as well. And the one thing I want to say about the catcher position is don't put too much stock into who I have listed here, because what I typically do, I just throw in whoever fits at the end of my lineup, because catcher position, outside of guys you want to use that are really good catchers and good lineups that you want to stack, like a Mitch Garver, like a JT Realmuto, Wilson Contreras, Gary Sanchez, those kind of guys, yeah, you're making a point of emphasis to get them in your lineup because they're part of a stack and you can actually count on their bats. Most of these guys are just, you're throwing in whoever fits at the end. So all I did pretty much was give you a high-end option, mid-range, and a cheap guy here. But Mitch Garver could be leading off here versus lefty and Jose Quintana. I do think the Minnesota Twins are a somewhat interesting stack here. Just the righties for the most part. So Byron Buxton, Nelson Cruz, Mitch Garver, even Jorge Polanco. These guys are all viable here versus Quintana. It's not a stack I absolutely love. I don't think he's a dumpster fire pitcher by any means. They only have a 4.53 implied team total in Vegas. But Mitch Garver, he is a guy that does excel versus left-handed pitching, although last year's numbers were overall pretty bad. But in seasons past, Mitch Garver was fantastic versus lefties. I realize he's super expensive, but it is hard to find a catcher in that prime of a hitting position, so I do think he is certainly viable. If you got the money for him, I'm not sure if we're going to have the money for him. I'd personally rather allocate my funds to positions like third base, shortstop, and even spending up in the outfield, so that's just me. But if you do want to spend up a catcher for some reason today, Mitch Garver is definitely an option, and he is on the late slate starting at 9:07. Wilson Ramos, I'm not going to just say who's in the late slate, early slate. You guys get the idea. The time's right on the screen there. If it's past 4 p.m., like if they're playing at like around 4, they're on the early slate, and if it's anything past that, they're obviously on the late slate. So 4 and earlier, early slate, and you guys get the idea. I'm not going to keep repeating that. Wilson Ramos, $4,100. He's going up against Cole Irvin here, the lefty on Oakland, and Wilson Ramos is a guy that actually has some decent numbers versus left-handed pitching over the past few seasons. Doesn't really strike out too much, makes a lot of contact, and Wilson Ramos isn't having that bad of a year so far, and the Tigers have been kind of a surprising offense. I know I still like to pick on them with pitchers, but there's been a few days now they're actually playing pretty well versus opposing pitchers, and looking at his numbers last season, only a 46 plate appearance sample size, but a batting average of 275, 341 WOBA, 118 WRC plus, 15% K rate, makes a lot of contact, not a lot of hard contact, but I think he's definitely a viable option, and he's going to hitting in a really prime spot in the order, hitting third here. I know it's not an exciting offense, but I think Wilson Ramos definitely makes some sense there. And then if you want an absolute punt option, we have Anthony Bemboom, mainly just because he has a fun name, but you get a nice lefty on righty matchup here versus Matt Shoemaker. Shoemaker's not a terrible pitcher, but he's not that good either, kind of just middle of the road for the most part. So Bemboom, I think he's a fine option. If you want to look at his numbers versus righties last year, they actually weren't too bad. It's a small sample size, but a WOBA close to 400, an ISO above 230, close to a 150 WRC plus with a 500 slugging, only a 16% K rate. So I think Bemboom, if you just want a complete punt option and he makes the lineup, I think he's a viable option down low. Dropping down to first base, lots of good options at first base. A couple guys that I wanted to put on here, but I didn't, were Paul Goldschmidt on the Cardinals. He's facing a lefty, and he's crushed lefties for how many seasons now, so I don't think that's going to stop here. So I think Goldschmidt's a fine option if you have the money for him. Just super expensive, but I love the spot versus Matt Moore. Not a pitcher that I would get too concerned about. As you can see, I have Nolan Arenado a little bit lower. I feel like he's a very similar play to Paul Goldschmidt, just on different positions. And then if you want to go cheaper, Mitch Moreland, kind of the great value version of Matt Olson in my opinion, but I think he's only like $3,600, and he's been very, very, very good versus right-handed pitching, so I think he's definitely a fine option versus Casey Mize, who has struggled versus lefties so far in his young career. But we'll start with Reese Hoskins, $4,400. He's got a lefty on the mound in St. Louis, and Reese Hoskins was a guy that was very, very good versus lefties last season. I mean, like, very, very good at 52% fly ball rate, 40% hard contact rate, a strikeout percentage below 10%, OPS of 1,200, WRC plus of 223, WOBA above 500, and ISO close to 400 with a batting average close to 350. So I like that price point for Reese Hoskins, and I do think the Phillies are a decent stack today. Vegas doesn't love him, only a 4.5 implied team total, but I can get behind using a few Phillies in my lineups today. Nate Lowe, I believe he's Lau. No, it's Lowe. He's Lowe. Then Brandon is Lau. I'm pretty sure. Either way, I still like him here. $4,300. He's got Dean Kramer. Kramer? Might be Kramer. Either way, I think he's going to get creamed. Bad joke there. But they do have a high implied team total of nearly 5 today, which is the highest on the entire slate. So I'm definitely pretty interested in these Texas Rangers bats today, especially the lefties. And if you want to look at low splits last season versus right-handed pitching, not too bad for a guy that's in the mid 4K range. He had a 352 WOBA, 269 ISO, 128 WRC plus, 519 slugging. Does strike out quite a bit, as does everybody on the Rangers, but Kramer's not a guy that I think is going to mow down this lineup. At a really low hard contact percentage, I will say that, only a 22% hard contact percent, but I still think he's a very fine option here, and I do like the Rangers stack quite a bit, also hitting high in the order as well. Then Matt Olson, $4,200. Casey Mize was very good in his last start versus the Houston Astros, but the Oakland A's do have one of the higher implied team totals on the slate at 4.65, and Olson's a guy that has some very, very strong numbers versus right-handed pitching. And looking at Mize's splits last season versus lefties, it was pretty bad. Only a 13-inning sample size, but 8.83 xFIP, a 16% K rate, 12% walk rate, a 333 ISO given up. I realize he's going to be better this year. I mean, it was his first season. He's a very young pitcher, so obviously he's going to make improvements, and there's high expectations for this guy, but I still think Matt Olson's a very fine option here at $4,200. Then going on to second base, this is not a position I like on either slate. I feel like it's probably one of the worst positions, if not the worst position today. But if you are stacking up the Cardinals versus Matt Moore, Tommy Edman looks like a pretty good option. Now the price point's terrible. I hate paying $5,200 for Tommy Edman. I mean, he's more money than Nolan Arenado, which seems a little bit crazy to me. So you're only getting there if you're doing a full-on Cardinal stack, because I cannot recommend just one-offing Tommy Edman unless you so happen to have $5,200 left at second base, which would feel like a weird thing to do, but he's got better splits versus lefties than he does righty. A strikeout percentage below 20%, 220 ISO, 358 WOBA, 317 batting average, so I think Edman's fine if you are stacking the Cardinals, but that's a tough price tag to get to. Jed Lowry, $4,300. He's a switch hitter, so I have the platoon advantage versus Casey Mize, and Lowry's been kind of on fire recently. He's been putting up numbers almost every single game. I know he didn't play last year, so I have no numbers to look at, but do prefer the lefties here versus Casey Mize for reasons I just mentioned earlier with Matt Olson. Nico Goodrum, $3,500. He's going to be facing a lefty on the mound in Oakland. Again, it's a pitcher's park, so it's hard to love the bats here, but Goodrum had some really good numbers versus lefties last season. He really struggled versus righties. Like, as you can see, dark orange, dark red numbers here all around, but versus lefties, some pretty good splits. A 50% hard contact rate, OPS above 1,000, did strike out quite a bit, but a near 700 slugging, 364 ISO, WOBA above 430, and a 333 batting average. It was a pretty small sample size, but I definitely can get behind some good room at a position that looks pretty bad on both slates. Then dropping out of third base, Nolan Arenado, $5,100. Some of the reasons I mentioned with Paul Goldschmidt, both these guys had some very, very strong numbers versus left-handed pitching, and Matt Moore is just not that great of a pitcher. So I could get behind some Cardinal stacks today. It's just they're kind of expensive, and it's not like it's a super elite spot. Their team total of 4.46 won't get you too excited, and there's some other stacks that have higher implied team totals at lower price points. Now, team totals in Vegas are not the end-all be-all. It's just a nice starting point to look at what teams Vegas like, because they're smart people, so I like to see who they like, but there's certainly some times where they miss, and a team with a team total of like 3 or 4 could definitely go off for like 6, 7, 8 runs. So it's not the end-all be-all, but it's a nice thing to look at, in my opinion. Then Josh Donaldson, $4,400, going up against the lefty and Jose Quintana. He's finally back, and he's going to be batting in a good spot in the order. His price point's fine. Versus lefties last season, only a 22 plate appearance sample size, so I'm not going to look too much into it, but he was pretty bad. And he has been hitting righties better the past couple of seasons, but Josh Donaldson's just a fine option. You're just looking for some cheap power versus a lefty. And then Yoan Moncada, $4,300. I feel like he's a bit too cheap here. And Nick Pavetta, he is a guy that might pick up some ownership just because SP2 on the early slate's not that great. It's not that great on either slate either. They only have a 4.37 implied team total here, but I think he's an interesting option because he does have some power versus right-handed pitching, more so than he does versus lefties. Looking at Moncada's last season versus right-handed pitching, it doesn't look too great. It strike out a lot, nearly 30% K rate, 306 WOBA, 226 batting average, only a 171 ISO. But I think he's going to be better than those numbers would suggest. And this is still a pretty good lineup for the White Sox. They did get Tim Anderson back, so it's definitely a boost. Still without Eloy Jimenez, obviously, for a long, long time, so that's an unfortunate blow to their lineup, but it's still fine. They can put up some runs. I don't like their low team total. I wish it was a little bit higher, but Nick Pavetta is a guy that can be a bit wild. He's got a nice strikeout rate at 24%, but he's got a 5.19 xFIP with a walk rate close to double digits with a near 300 ISO given up dating back to last season. Also, only a 27% ground ball rate and nearly a 50% fly ball rate. This is a hitter-friendly park in Boston as well. So Yoan Moncada, like that price point quite a bit. I do think the White Sox could be a decent stack on this slate. Now, I would not be surprised if that team total does rise as the day goes on. Tim Anderson, $5,200, very similar reasons to what I just mentioned with Moncada, so I'm not going to go over that again, but Tim Anderson's a guy that had a really good year last season. He hits for a high batting average, 322 batting average, 22% K rate, 142 WRC plus, and a 376 WOBA with an ISO of 200. Should be leading off here. And shortstop's not a great position on either site. Usually shortstop is a loaded position, but that does not seem to be the case this time around, so I'm having a hard time finding some shortstop plays that I do like quite a bit. But Anderson, he's on a team that I do think you could stack today. They are kind of expensive, but I mean, he's obviously a great hitter, and Nick Pavetta can certainly be in a spot where he could blow up. Now, he could obviously have a good game as well. It's just kind of pitcher he is, but there's certainly some upside to be had here for the Chicago White Sox. Falefa, $4,700, should be leading off here for the Rangers. They're a team that I actually do want to stack on the late slate because they do have the highest implied team total, close to 5, and the Baltimore Orioles pitching staff never really scares me too much. I know they can put together some decent games, and their bullpen's still not that great, though, so I do think the Rangers are in a pretty good spot. Prefer the lefties, but you can still play Falefa as he is going to be leading off. Then Paul DeJong, $4,100. Kind of already mentioned this earlier, but I do like the Cardinals stack today versus Matt Moore. Just not a pitcher that I think is all that great. So Paul DeJong, I like the price point. He's actually one of the cheaper Cardinals that I do think are viable on the slate at $4,100. So if you want to play him at that price point, or if you're just stacking up the Cardinals, I think he makes sense. You could play him as a one-off as well, just because I don't think the position is that great. Dropping down to the outfield, we have two big boppers here, Mike Trout and Nelson Cruz, who are both in pretty elite spots here. Mike Trout, the best hitter in baseball versus right-handed pitching, and Nelson Cruz, pretty much the best hitter in baseball versus left-handed pitching. So it's whatever you prefer there, because they are both on the main slate, the late main slate, I should say, and they're both playing in the same game. You're probably not going to be able to get up to both. So I guess it would depend if you have more Twins in your lineup, or if you just can't get up to Mike Trout. But if I had to pick one, and salary didn't matter, I would say Mike Trout over Nelson Cruz. If both are obviously elite options here, but Mike Trout, we'll start with him. $6,100, super expensive price tag, but anytime he's facing a mediocre righty on the mound, it's always one of the top home run spots of the entire day, because Mike Trout just is just amazing versus righties. I mean, I know a lot of righties are better versus lefties, but Mike Trout is better versus righties, and he absolutely murders them. Last season, he had a 52% fly ball rate, 180 WRC plus, 370 ISO, 433 WOBA, batting average close to 300. You guys don't need to tell you that Mike Trout is good at baseball, because I think you guys get the idea. Same way you don't need me to tell you that Nelson Cruz is good versus lefties, because I say it every single time he sees a lefty on the mound. But a strikeout rate of below 8% last season, 465 batting average, 586 WOBA, ISO of 442. Just absolutely insane numbers from Nelson Cruz. So yes, if you have the money for him, he's a fantastic play. If not, I don't think it's too big of a deal. But if I could get up to either a Mike Trout or Nelson Cruz on the late slate, I would feel very, very good about it. Shohei Ohtani, $5,000. He's getting pretty expensive. I missed the days when he was in the low 4K range. Unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. You could also play him at first base as well. But the Angels aren't that bad of a stack. I know they're going to be without Anthony Rendon, which does hurt the overall lineup, but I could get behind some David Fletcher, Shohei Ohtani, Mike Trout. Even Jose Iglesias at shortstop hasn't been too bad of an option. I don't think shortstop's that great of a spot today, and I do have the 2 guys out of the 3 are on the early slate, so we could probably get some Jose Iglesias action on the late slate. Jared Walsh hasn't been too bad, and Justin Upton hit that grand slam last night. I think they scored like 10 or 11 runs, so I could get behind an Angel stack. I think it might be a little bit too low in Vegas at 4.47 because Matt Shoemaker, well, he's not terrible. He's just not the greatest pitcher out there. So yeah, anyway, Shohei Ohtani, he's fine. He has some good power versus right-handed pitching. Then getting into some mid-range options, we have Michael Brantley at $4,500 versus Chris Flexen. Just not that great of a pitcher. Michael Brantley's an elite contact hitter with some pop in his bat versus righties, so I do think Brantley is a fine option. Plus, you guys know he's my favorite player in baseball. He's my logo over on DraftKings, so anytime I can recommend playing Michael Brantley, I will do just that. Joey Gallo, $4,400. He might be my favorite play in the late slate once you factor in matchup and the price point, because at $4,400, I mean, this is a really good home run spot for Joey Gallo. He's going up against Dean Kramer here, who's just not that great of a pitcher. Last season, he did have a nice strikeout rate at 27%, but a 5.14 xFIP, 15% walk rate, and close to a 50% fly ball rate. I don't like that high strikeout rate he had, but it was a pretty small sample size of 18.2 innings, so I'm not going to go too deep into that. I don't think he's going to hold that this season, but Joey Gallo is a guy, he will strike out a ton, but when he makes contact, he can certainly make the most of it. He had a 52% fly ball rate to righties last year. Very low batting average, but he's got plenty of pop in his bat. We know that. Does walk quite a bit as well. So Joey Gallo, definitely in a really good home run spot in my opinion. Plus the Rangers are looking like the best stack on the late slate as of right now. Kyle Tucker, $4,300. He's got some nice power in his bat versus right-handed pitching. And with some of the guys out for the Astros, he should be hitting higher in the order compared to where he usually hits, as he usually hits around 7th. Should get bumped up to 5th tonight, so I do think he's in a pretty good spot at $4,300. Jesse Winker, $4,200. I like Tristan McKenzie. I think he's a pretty talented young pitcher, but again, in the same sentence, he's still a young pitcher that can make some mistakes, and we saw that last time out versus the Chicago White Sox. So I think Jesse Winker is a fine option here on a team leading off for a team that's been on fire so far to start the season. Also in a favorable park for hitting as well. So Jesse Winker, fine splits versus righties. I think he does make some sense here. Looking at his numbers specifically at righties last year, it was really, really good. A walk rate close to 20%, OPS close to 1,000, WRC plus of 148, well above 400, 252 batting average, and a 304 ISO. So Winker definitely in a fine spot, even though I don't love the rest today because I think Tristan McKenzie is fine, but he'll probably make a mistake here or there, and Winker could be one of those guys that takes advantage of that. Andrew McCutchen, $3,600, kind of mentioned this earlier, but I do like the Philly righties here versus Kim, the lefty, and McCutchen's got some decent splits versus lefties. He's not the same player he was back in the day on the Pirates, but still an overall fine hitter. A batting average close to 300 last season versus lefties, well above 400, 153 WRC plus, and a lot of fly balls as well. A 60% fly ball rate to lefties. So I can definitely get behind some Andrew McCutchen. David Dahl, just a cheaper lefty on the Texas Rangers here for a stack that I do think is pretty viable on the late slate. Then for cheap, and there's a lot of other good cheap bats. I'm talking like in the 2K range. Ronnie Dawson's $2,000. I think Scott Shebel, that's how you say his last name. He's $2,000. So you could look at them as well, where they're just pure pump plays. But DJ Stewart's actually got some decent pop in his bat versus right-handed pitching. He went deep last night versus Fulte, absolutely crushed that pitch. But versus righties last season, only a 93 plate appearance sample size, which is actually not too bad, but still a little bit low. But he had a near 20% walk rate. Will strike out quite a bit, but a 42% fly ball rate, 376 wellbone, and ISO close to 300 with a 140 WRC plus. So if you're looking for some cheap power in a favorable matchup, DJ Stewart is that guy. And I actually played him in my main lineup last night. Ended up working out pretty well because he did get that walk and hit a nice homer like I just mentioned. So that being said, guys, I think that's going to be it for the video. So I hope it was helpful, and if it was, make sure you leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. I really do appreciate it. If you want access to the projections, the data sheet, optimizer, rankings, ownership projections, all that fun stuff, Discord community as well, link is down below. If you guys like NASCAR, I do a NASCAR DFS video that I post every single week. I'll try to link that somewhere on the screen, but I think that's going to be it. Hope you guys enjoy the start to your weekend. I'll see you guys in the next video.